So it's my first year in the US and I'm making my first Halloween costume ever. So growing up, I never really celebrated Halloween in Singapore. Halloween was just not a thing for my family. So I never had costumes, never went trick-or-treating. I don't really feel the affinity towards Halloween like so many people that I know on Instagram. It seems to be something super magical for them, which I can kind of relate because I feel the same amount of joy when it comes to Mid-Autumn Festival with mooncakes and lanterns. My favorite festival, really. This year being my first year in the US, I want to kind of be in on the festivity. I just really wanted something simple and I wanted to be able to use something that I got that is old. So I'm making my Halloween costume using this fabric panel by Cranston Printworks that I got off of eBay. So fabric panels are really fun. They come in about half to 1 yard and they already have like patterns and designs printed on it. So all you have to do is pretty much just cut out the pieces, stitch them together, and then you get something like a teddy bear or like a basket and things like that. And Cranston Printworks actually has a lot of fabric panels specifically for Halloween costumes, like this little blue wizard, this computer kid, this candy man, and also this big pumpkin that I was actually really tempted to get. And then also this little pumpkin, which gave me so many questions like, okay, it's designed for a teddy, but will it fit a little baby? And will it fit my dog? Little pumpkin dog. So I'm making my Halloween costume using the fabric panel called Little Devil Costume. So this Little Devil costume, and along with a lot of the other costumes that I just mentioned earlier, they're designed for kids because kids are smaller, so you need smaller pattern pieces and you can fit everything in half to a yard. But being a petite person, I felt like I could potentially make it work. So I decided to just get the fabric panel and see what happens. Before I actually got started on working on my Halloween costume, I had to tell my dog firmly, no, you will not stay here in the studio to help me out. No, you are not helping. Because instead of providing emotional support for my sewing, my dog actually gives emotional distress. The little spot that my dog chewed on. Good thing is, he didn't actually get into the design of the cape itself. Once the actual real devil in this video has been chased out of my sewing studio, I proceeded with cutting up the fabric panel pattern pieces. It took me a few minutes before I actually realized that I've been doing it all wrong. I don't know why I didn't think about this beforehand, but it's probably much easier for me to just use a rotary cutter to cut the pieces out, and that's what I'm gonna do now. I've only just started using the rotary cutter recently, but once I actually discovered the magic of a rotary cutter, I just started questioning myself, like, what else am I not doing that's actually helping myself to make my sewing and cutting a lot more efficient? What about you? Are you team regular fabric scissors or team rotary cutter? After cutting all the pattern pieces of the fabric panel, I took a minute to make sure that I've got the mood set right by playing my spooky playlist on Spotify before I started with sewing. Not sponsored by Spotify. I also took a moment to wonder if I should let Ramses back in my sewing studio because that cute little face is hard to say no to. But I needed to focus and I needed to make my costume, so I went back to my sewing machine. I started by sewing the devil's horns and the hood together. And if you have watched some of my other videos here, you will also know that I like to sew pieces together without breaking the thread in between. This helps to reduce thread waste because we don't actually have to leave a long tail of thread every time we break the thread and start sewing a new piece. The hood is a little tight on me. This part is too short. I've decided to actually use this little strip that's supposed to be part of the collar, and I'm gonna actually attach that here. I need maybe this much. Don't worry, I actually ended up using an actual measuring tape to figure out how much longer I needed the hood to be. I mean, it looks like a swim cap right now, but I think we can make it work. So to make the hood work for me, I unpicked the stitches and cut a little strip of fabric from the collar pattern piece and added this little strip of fabric between the hood just to add a little bit more width to it. Then I measured the final width of the hood, figured out how much longer I needed the hood to be, and used these measurements to figure out how much of a chunk of fabric I needed to cut out using the other collar pattern piece. This little chunk of fabric was stitched to the bottom of the hood. For some reason, the chunk of fabric that I cut and stitched to the bottom of the hood was a little shorter than I needed it to be. I decided that the best way to solve this problem was to actually just pretend that it didn't happen. So I just trimmed the excess bit off. After fixing the width and the length of the hood, I went on to work on my devil's horns. With the right sides together, I pressed about 1 centimeter of seam allowance towards the wrong side. Then I turned the horns right sides out and made sure that I have really pointy horns by using a pair of fabric scissors to kind of push the tip out, and also used a sewing needle to get the really end of the tips out. I filled my devil's horns using polyester filling that I saved from dog beds that my dog chewed up. Oh, which dog? Oh, well, remember him? The devil's horns were added to the hood by hand sewing. And despite the fact that I don't actually like hand sewing, this is the part of the project that I actually enjoyed the most because it's what transformed a swim cap into this. I know I've made a number of changes to the hood, and of course I needed to make a change to the cape as well. I remembered that I've got this stash of pom-poms that I brought with me from Singapore to Texas, and I thought the black pom-poms would look perfect when sewn onto the hem of the cape. But first, I needed to make sure that I actually had enough of that pom-pom trimming to sew to the bottom of the cape. I folded the cape in half and then ran a measuring tape across the bottom and multiplied that number by 2. Because multiplying 32 by 2 is much easier than dragging a measuring tape across 64 inches worth of fabric. Before I could measure the length of pom-pom trimming that I had to detangle it from being rolled up into a ball, placed into a plastic bag, and put away in storage for a couple of years. It was a little annoying, but it's definitely much better than having to detangle hair that's been stuck in a round hairbrush. And all that effort was totally worth it because I did have enough pom-pom trimming for my cape. Being the impatient person that I am, I wanted to sandwich the pom-pom trimming between the 2 cape pattern pieces and just sew everything together along the hem at one go. Before I could start sewing, I kind of realized that this would be a little tricky, and since I really hate unpicking stitches, I decided to take it slow. So I ended up sewing the pom-pom trimming on one of the cape pieces first, then laid the second cape piece on top of the first cape piece, right sides together, and stitched along the hem once more. After sewing the hem of the cape together, I also sewed the straight side seams together. Then I vacuumed the floor of my sewing studio a little before I placed the camera at the perfect angle for this shot, and then sat down on the floor and turned the cape inside out. It's looking good! To make the seams sit flat and to give a nice professional finish, I edge stitched the side seams and the round bottom hem. Edge stitched. It's a hard word. Edge stitched. And now it's time to add bias tape along this part of the cape. The bias tape is meant to be sewn along the neckline of the cape so that the cape can be worn around the neck by tying a little bow like this. And so to determine the length of bias tape that I needed on each end to make a nice looking bow, I used my trusty measuring tape once more. I decided that I wanted a bow that looked this big with a tail this long, and the number that I got was 35. I was meant to divide this number by 2, but I forgot, so I ended up with 35 inches worth of bias tape on each side. It's definitely a lot longer than I wanted it to be initially, but I'm still okay with it. And here is the costume! So here's my first Halloween costume ever! Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the project has turned out. I actually ended up adding a little dart onto the back of the hood just so it would fit the back of my head better, because the top of the head is round but the back where it joins with the neck, it's kind of like flat, if it makes sense. So the dart really helped to make the hood sit closer to my head, and I also added a little elastic closure with the snap button at the end, so I could actually get in and out of the hood pretty easily without ruining my makeup. Very important. And I think adding the pom-poms was a really good idea. I like how it added more visual interest to Cape Lit, and I mean, pom-poms just make everything cuter, right? And you might have noticed I ended up with a collar piece that I didn't actually use at all. I feel like next year I will definitely revisit this costume and maybe make like a little devil's trident and add a little devil's tail. So next week I'll be sharing my first garment that I'm making from my autumn-winter 2021 capsule. If you don't want to miss that, subscribe to the channel and I will see you again next week. Bye!